Season 9, Episode 10 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
Mark Bishop.
and we are, of course, reading Orestes Brownson's The American Republic, its Constitution, Tendencies, and Destiny, this time talking about the Constitution of the United States. This is another, I think, two-part chapter. We'll keep talking about this topic for the next chapter as well. But this was a really good one, picked up kind of where we left off last week, where he was just talking about, what the United States is, and his distinction between two constitutions and things like that. And he brings that into this discussion about how there are two constitutions of the United States and how those interact and have interacted throughout history. I thought it was great.
Yeah. And I really love his writing style because every new chapter, his first sentence or first couple sentences just summarizes the topic so well and succinctly. Like he says, just to begin this one, the Constitution of the United States is twofold, written and unwritten, the Constitution of the people and the Constitution of the government. And that's a really wild way to look at it, which maybe I'm ignorant of a lot of constitutional law theory, but I had not really considered that as like a separate analysis or two separate topics in a way. But anyway, so I thought that was good. And then he's talking about the written Constitution, which is like the big C Constitution, and then the unwritten or the real an actual Constitution of the nation, which is a wild framing that he puts on this. And he says it's that Constitution is providential, not made by the nation, but born with it. I don't know what I think about that. Do you agree with that? I don't know that I think he's starting to lose me on this chapter.
I don't know. I think I still agree with them. Because I mean, it's all going back to his point about like it's all based on real historical fact, right? Not abstract theory. And so I think he's right that the constitution of a nation really develops over time, and develops, subconsciously in a way, like not through written abstract principles or through written documents, but in the beliefs and the cohesion of the people themselves. So when he's talking about providential, it's not like it's just imparted on them by God, but it's, God working through history and working through people, and they develop really the society that suits the people because the people are the sovereign here.
I'm starting to anticipate that he would support those left-wing people that talk about a living constitution and how to evolve over time, and you find it in the appendices and the indices and the penumbras, different rights and responsibilities. So I don't know how his argument would fit in with that because he's saying, well, yeah, you can write it down, but the real Constitution is what we all agreed to. And if we all kind of agree that, abortion's in the Constitution, I guess abortion's in the Constitution.
Yeah, it's a good question.
I just think about that one, didn't I?
But it's I don't know if you'd go that far. I mean, we're kind of just, looking at this, over 100 years later, so I don't know what he would think about that. But because it's not just that it's whatever the people agree by compact becomes, the beliefs of the actual nation. Right, because that's another point he's stressed, where it's not just like if, the people vote to decide something, it doesn't automatically make it so, right?
Yes.
So it's there has to be a different level, even if a majority of people now do support abortion, I don't think he would agree that that is now something that is part of the constitution of the country necessarily.
Well, I think for 50 years, people were taking the position that the right to abortion was in the Constitution.
Yeah.
And so it kind of was by his reading.
Maybe.
And so that's why I'm like, I don't know. I mean, he makes it. I think what his analysis is very descriptive of especially the formation of a nation and what a nation is, and because like he talks about the two different types of constitutions. It's, you could write down whatever you want, but if that's not what the people agreed to, or that's not consistent with what the people do, state does, then it's just a piece of paper, I guess. Which I think you would agree with that. But he does talk about the unique nature of the kind of moving on, the nature of the United States or America, and our Constitution, both written and this providential one. And he mentions, I'll just quote from the book here: it belongs to the Greco-Roman family and is republican as distinguished from despotic constitutions, but comes under the head of neither monarchical nor aristocratic, neither democratic nor mixed constitutions, and creates a state which is neither a centralized state nor a confederacy.
Hmm.
And so and it's still, I think, really unique in the world in that sense that it doesn't have, the monarchy. It's not a confederacy. It's more centralized now, of course, a
Yeah.
lot more than he was alive. But we do have this. We do have a much stronger federalist system,
Hmm.
with the supposed reserving of the power, well, ultimately to the people, but also to the states, which makes the United States a lot different
Yeah.
than any other country. I mean, I don't
Hmm.
know if anything's that close to what we have. You see the separation of powers in some manner, in other constitutions, but ours is unique in that way. But then we also have these separate sovereigns
Yeah.
we call the 50 states, and then all the political
Yeah. And
subdivisions.
he makes that point really well, because he says the difficulty of understanding it is augmented by the peculiar use under it of the word state. 'Cause he
Yeah,
says, to the Americans, that doesn't mean a sovereign community or political society complete in itself, but it's also not a political society subordinate to another political society and dependent on it. He says the American states are all sovereign states united, but disunited are not states at all. And so it's like not
yeah,
that they're tiny little things that can't exist on their own necessarily. They're all dependent on one higher thing, but they're also not, able to sustain themselves by themselves. It's this weird middle ground where they have to be united or they don't exist at all.
right. Because like if Missouri stopped being one of the states of the United States, we wouldn't be the independent nation of Missouri.
Yeah.
We would just be, a territory, or we'd just be a region,
Hmm.
because we don't have a separate identity and borders and all that. I mean, especially on the Kansas side, it's like you walk across the street. At least we have the the river separating us from those heathens in Illinois. The same thing with Arkansas and Iowa.
Yeah.
You just keep driving up the road, and all of a sudden you're in Iowa.
Hmm.
And anyway, so I think he's right about that. And that is unique.
Hmm. Yeah, because he
Mhm.
says the union and the states are coeval, born together, and can exist only together. Separation is dissolution, the death of both. So again,
Yes,
exactly to that point, like if you try to just remove one from the other, both cease to exist. They're entirely intertwined in the system where they have to be united, but are not necessarily subordinate one to the other.
and he does a great job of really elaborating on that argument where he talks about, especially when you talk about, well, it hasn't happened in, well, has that happened in my lifetime? Where a territory's become a state. The most recent one is what, Hawaii?
Yeah,
That was
Hawaii and
that.
Alaska.
I think the most recent one was either 50s or 60s, I think, and I was born
Yeah.
in seven. But when we were advancing, we being the United States was advancing to the west, the territories, which later became states such as Missouri and Iowa and Nebraska and Kansas, were just that they were territories of the United States. They were not a separate state until Congress,
Hmm.
allowed them statehood, and added them to the role of states, which have their own separate sovereign powers. But again, it's a great argument to really say, well, you can't separate them out, because especially those that were formed from the territories, there's a much stronger argument that those could never separate from
Yeah.
the United States, because the original 13 colonies, you could say, well, after we defeated England, then they're separate states,
Hmm.
and then they joined in the Union. But everybody that was created after, every state that was created after that, I think he's 100% right that they didn't exist as a state, except for maybe Texas, which actually was a nation for a little period of
Yeah.
time. That they could not be considered a freestanding state if they decided to secede. And I
Hmm.
think there's a lot more truth to that. And of course, he's very much, even, and says it again in this chapter, that it's a good thing that the Union forces prevailed to
Yeah.
the secessionists to prove that is not possible. You cannot secede.
Hmm.
Once you're in, once you're in the club, you can't get out. Kind of like, what is it, the Russian mafia? Um, unless you're John Wick and you do an
Yeah,
impossible task.
yeah, there you go. That's a good reference there. But yeah, no, he does talk about that a lot with the bringing in of new states and things like that. He makes that a little bit earlier on, as well with, when even in the revolutionary times or immediately thereafter,
Yeah.
really the states weren't acting as though they were separate sovereign entities. They thought that they had to appeal to some sort of Congress. There was some idea that there was a united thing above them. And so the very fact that they didn't, completely split up after the Revolutionary War and that they wanted something different, even if that plan didn't succeed at first, with the
Yes.
Articles of Confederation, shows that there is a union there, that there has to be a United States that exists
And
at the same time as the states.
yeah, and where he describes that a little more in detail, I think is again persuasive because he said when the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, the written Constitution, were formed, it really was not adopted as a treaty,
Hmm.
as you would with any like treaty with a foreign nation. Instead, it was adopted by the various states and just approved to be part of this union, as opposed to well, we're having this treaty so that we have free trade and maybe common defense, or we'll defend, if you get attacked, we'll defend you and you me. It wasn't that at all. It was forming this new union, which would be
Hmm.
one nation that was understood with one foreign policy for all of those colonies. I think that's a really good argument against allowing cessation uh, secession from those individual colonies that formed the United States to begin with.
Hmm.
I find that really 100% persuasive on that
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah. Kind of, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead or I'm about where you are, but on page 115, kind of towards the bottom, he makes a good point. Talking again about the Constitutional Convention. He says the convention did not create the Union or unite the states, for it was assembled by the authority of the United States who were present in it. The United States or Union
Right.
existed before the convention, as the convention itself affirms in declaring one of its purposes to be to provide for a more perfect union. So he's saying, that union already
Yes.
existed. They're just looking how to better enumerate it, better describe it, better create something that shows how this union actually functions and create a more working system to reflect the character of the people. Right. So this union's already in
Yes.
place. This union exists by, the lowercase c constitution, the constitution of the people who see themselves as one. Now we have to figure out how do we get a government to work in accordance with that existing union.
Yes. And then his other argument, which I think is supports that whole line of reasoning, is when you talk about what's the preamble where it says "we the people
Hmm.
of the United States." It doesn't say "we the states and the people therein"
Hmm.
in order to form a more perfect union. It's "we the people," which is the all the people within the now newly formed United States. And I think that is supportive of his theory. Now, to his credit, he does say that basically he summarizes some of the arguments against what he's talking about,
Hmm.
including from Calhoun and Madison and some of the framers.
Yeah.
That these were separate sovereigns, and that this constitution was a new constitution formed by the states,
Hmm.
as opposed to among the people, and there was some sort of providential constitution. So, and he takes that head on, because I thought, well, you know what, wouldn't it be important to ask or find some writing of the framers of the country, the people that wrote it? Wouldn't they have a better idea of what it meant and who the parties were? And of course, Madison and Jefferson and Adams, I think, would have been, if you'd asked them this. So no, these are the separate colonies and states. The separate
Hmm.
states formed this constitution. They were separate, and they had their own um, boundaries and borders, their own people, and people would know that they were either Virginians or from Massachusetts or
Hmm.
Georgia. They had a separate identity in
Yeah.
sorts, and a lot of people didn't travel as much.
Hmm.
So I mean, you're born in Georgia, you're a Georgian, and so I think their argument would have been, and he mentions this, that this was a formation of the states, and ratified by the separate states. But then I think he addresses that fairly well,
Yeah.
uh, where he's talking about it's not a treaty, and it's one sovereign, and it could, like, if you had these separate sovereigns, it would be an agency but not a government. I mean,
Hmm.
not a treaty. It's not, they're not separate
Yeah.
sovereigns. And I think his argument about, the language used as far as we the people, et cetera,
Hmm.
and the Constitution really kind of rebuts that,
Yeah.
even though the framers kind of had that concept, I
Hmm.
think.
Yeah,
Right.
because I really like what he says because he's not saying that they're entirely wrong because he has this big long quote that he pulls out from Madison, and he's
Yes.
saying he does accurately describe here in this big long Madison quote about how it was the people of the United States. It wasn't the states themselves making this compact, but it was the people. And he says he's describing this accurately and that we do have these separate spheres for each individual unit, and he's very correct. But he says the reason that, Adams or Madison or Jefferson are viewing it in this way is really because they're just kind of talking in the language. He says this was merely the effect of the general doctrine which he had adopted in common with nearly all his contemporaries of the origin of the state and compact. So that he's just
Right.
saying, really, they just kind of bought into this, theoretical framework, and they probably believe that, but they're still describing the system accurately. You just kind of have to pull it out from apart just the social compact theory, and they're still describing the system accurately, just coming at it in a different framework that, of course, Brownson doesn't believe at all.
Right. Right. But yeah, I appreciated that he at least stated their position
Hmm.
fairly,
Yeah.
and then used their words, or responded to them in order to
Hmm.
support his argument. I think he
Yeah.
did an excellent
Yeah.
job, um,
And I think
but anyway,
his the point that he's making, I think, is best summarized at the bottom of page 115. And you're talking again about the convention. He says, in interpreting its language, it is necessary to distinguish between its act and its theory. Its act is law, its theory is not. So even if they are operating in this theoretical framework of the social compact, right, it didn't really create a system that was just these disjointed units coming together in this compact fashion. It was really creating a system, like you said, it's not a treaty. It's not this separate thing, but it's this distinct union that had already existed beforehand. You have to look at the what it actually did rather than what theories they had behind it. I think that's a
yes.
good point. I think it's a great point.
Yep. And then he immediately segues into on 116, where he talks about, like, reasserts his theory, where he says the convention certainly professes to grant or concede powers to the United States and to prohibit powers to the states, but it simply puts the state for the government.
Hmm.
The powers of the United States are indeed grants or trusts, but from God through the law of nature, and are grants, trusts, or powers always conceded to every nation or sovereign people.
Hmm.
So he's basically saying, yeah, this is how you describe it, but that's always granted by God, the law of nature to every
Hmm.
nation, every sovereign people. You're just describing it and kind of organizing it.
Yeah.
He's kind of ascribing to them the role of clerk,
Yeah.
you know, or scribe. Here, file this.
Hmm.
Um, which I don't. I mean, I'm overstating it a little bit,
Yeah.
but I think he's saying that these rights and grants and held in trust were created by God,
Hmm.
and the people, and that the framework, I think, that they created, of course, is brilliant. But I think the consensus was, as I understand it, that they wanted these kind of controls and limitations on the national government.
Yeah.
The people generally were upset about certain particular issues, and they
Hmm.
certainly wanted to have Bill of Rights, which was added after the Constitution was ratified, which is kind of an interesting process they went through there. But with the structure of the government, they wanted to have protections and limitations on power. And then, of course, there's a big argument about, well, do you want to have this centralized power? And if you don't have a centralized power, your financial system won't work, and you won't have
Hmm.
a correct foreign policy,
Yeah.
defend yourself from England, Spain, and France, and all that.
Hmm.
But generally, it was a reflection of what the people wanted, which was a limited government
Hmm.
and a more local control through the state governments, as I
Yeah.
understand it.
Yeah.
So
I
yeah,
really
but
like.
anyway, but
Yeah, I really like what he
go
says
ahead.
because when he's talking about the kind of viewing it as two separate distinct things, he says the more exact term is for the one the general government, and for the others particular governments as having charge only of the particular interests of the state, and the two together constitute the government of the United States. So it's wrong to look at it as two entirely separate governments and these two like competing systems where each is trying to get power from the other. Maybe that's more true now. But he's saying, in the actual construction of the United States, it really is one government. One just has a charge for the general United States as a whole. But then the state governments are governments' particular interests, for those people living in that state. And again, he mentions, kind of going back to that, that we, the people of the United States, by writing those words, by framing it in that way, says it just place the sovereign power where it is in the people of the states united, not the people of each individual state coming together, but this United States, this separate thing
Yeah.
that is one whole.
Yeah. And then at the, and I'm probably jumping ahead because I tend to do that, but at the very end of 120,
Hmm.
he kind of disregards everything that the framers had said, because he says, but the philosophy, the theory of government, the understanding of the framers of the Constitution must be considered if the expression will be allowed as obiter dicta, and be judged on their merits. This is the key quote. What binds is the thing done, not the theory on which it was done, or on which the actors explained their work either to themselves or to others.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very true when you talk about people in power, of all types, because everybody has an explanation of what they're doing, and it's not necessarily what it was that was done.
Yeah.
Especially if they're tyrants. People always say that they're on the right side of history and
Mm-hmm.
they're doing good work. Um, but so I think he has a point generally, but that's basically his reasoning for why we don't have to listen to,
Mm-hmm.
don't have to listen to them, but we don't have to accept their version of what
Mm-hmm.
was going on 100%, because obviously they disagree with them
Yeah.
on some of the main issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because what he says here at the bottom of page 119, so I'm going a little bit before you, but he says, talking again about the Civil War, he says, now we can see and we can kind of re-examine these things in a better historical light now that we've been through this whole process and realize, no, it is actually one united whole and not several states joined in a confederacy. And he says, the facts don't really sustain, he's talking about Calhoun or Webster. He doesn't really sustain either of their points of view. He says Mr. Calhoun because he had purposes to accomplish which demanded state sovereignty, and Mr. Webster because he examined them in the distorting medium of the theory or understanding of the statesmen of the 18th century. So he's saying, really, when they're writing and when they're trying to describe this, they're really coming at it in their own sort of individual framework, right? And it doesn't really accord with what we know about the actual, lowercase c Constitution of the people of the United States, right? That's something different than what they're describing. And they have a lot of truth in what they're writing about and describing how the government works and things like that. But they're so wrapped up in either what they personally want from the convention or what their sort of theoretical framework is that it's not 100%, certain that they're 100% right on those things. He says, the political philosophers, of centuries past didn't really believe this. They were really just kind of wrapped up in what was sort of the popular idea at the time. We have to go back to a more, in his view, eternal way of looking at things, something that points to a more higher truth.
Yeah. It's a good summary of what he's saying, and he starts to lose me on how strongly he refutes what their explanation of their actions were.
Yeah.
At the very end, he says something that I don't know is supported
Hmm.
by his argument 100%, where he says the American people were not made one people by the written Constitution, as Mr. Jefferson, Madison, Webster, and so many others suppose, but were made so by the unwritten Constitution, born with and inherent in them. So, I mean, I guess he's true that the American people were an American people at
Hmm.
that point, but I don't know. I think they were still the American people were certainly a work in progress
Yeah.
before the United States Constitution was formed and ratified. I think that was kind of it's kind of like for me it's kind of like when you bake a cake and you pull it out halfway before it's done. Yeah, is that a cake? Well, if you cut into it, it's going to be a mess, and so I think what they did was they really baked all the
Mm.
ingredients, and they have they put icing on it and all that stuff, and so then it's cake. For that analogy, I don't know if that really works, but I just feel like they're the ones, going through that process and having it ratified by the representatives from each state, really solidified it or, really made it effective.
Hmm.
Because if they wouldn't have done that, then I mean, I don't think he's making a deterministic argument
Hmm.
that it was going to happen no matter what. I think you need, especially if it's not a monarchy, where it's just hereditary and it's just might makes right type of thing. I think you have to have that written constitution approved and followed
Yeah.
by the people before you really have a constitution of people either.
Mm.
know, you have to have a certain amount of buy-in and enforcement. And I don't know. I think he overstates his case. I
Yeah.
guess what I'm saying.
He might, and I think one of the big things is going forward is to see what he has to say about, changing the Constitution and how people change over time. I think that's really key. Because I mean, if he does sort of overstate the case and say, well, it just depends on, if his argument comes down to what we were talking about the beginning of the episode, that it kind of just depends on what the people believe at any given moment in time, then I think his theory doesn't hold as much water, because then it's just nothing is really real and everything's just relative to what came before. And so I think he needs, and I hope he will, because I mean, he's going to talk about the destiny of the United States at some point in here. I'd be curious to see what he says about what happens when people change. If, like, the
Yeah.
Constitution, the capital C Constitution, needs to change because of that, or if it's really we should stick with this because that was the character of the people when it was created. Because I think that would solve a lot of the questions that you're raising there of just how this actually functions and how much the written Constitution is necessary for the existence of the lowercase Constitution.
Right. Right. Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
But I mean, I think his logic makes sense, right? It's a very coherent argument. But yeah, I think it is, and if there is an issue at all, it is just with how much he states it, and how much he tries to disagree with the founders, for sure.
Well, he asserts it. And
Yeah.
that, I guess part of my problem is that, okay, well, some of it, he does a very good job. Like I mentioned, okay, well, where he's refuting that that they're separate sovereigns. I think he does a great job about that, whether they're true sovereign nations or states that can come and go out of this union at their option. I think he's 100% does a great job with that. But where he's saying, I'm having a real hard time going down the entire path for the two constitution arguments.
Hmm.
But I think if he's just saying you can't make a people a nation just by adopting a written constitution, I agree with him 100%,
Yeah.
because we've seen examples of that in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and other places, across the world last 50 years, 60 years maybe, where we, being the United States and our allies, have kind of supported or foisted a governmental system on another people,
Hmm.
and with borders. Well, like you look at like the part of the mess in the Middle East is because Great Britain had conquered that area, had maps that said, okay, this is Transjordan and this is ultimately Israel, and this is these other areas, and like Iraq and Kuwait, there are arbitrary lines that are imposed upon them.
Hmm.
And even the India-Pakistan one, which I think we talked briefly about last episode, that boundary was actually drafted by the British government too, although
Yeah.
demanded by the Indian people to have some sort of separation. But so I mean, so I think if that's all he's saying, I'm 100% with him. But if he's saying that that like there's some sort of deterministic argument that once you have a people or a nation that consider themselves a nation or a sovereign, then the Constitution is going to flow from that automatically. I just don't think that's true. I think it's a dual process.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I think that is kind of what he's saying. That it is just the fact that you can't just create a constitution out of nothing.
Yeah.
Because I'm 100% with them that, the people have to develop, of their own accord in such a way that they create the constitution that's best for them. Because it can't just, pop out of nowhere. It has to accord with their beliefs and with their customs and things like that. And I think that's a really great point for right now. as we're seeing with all the talks of mass migration and, well, what's the issue if, 20,000 people come into this town of 40,000, right? They're just people.
Right.
People are the same everywhere. We know that people aren't the
Yeah.
same everywhere. You
Right.
have to have a people that has the same customs and has the same beliefs for them to even recognize really the laws of that people, right? They might be forced to obey the laws, but they won't have any
Yeah.
idea of, well, this of why those laws are important or why they reflect the particular character of that people.
Well, and I probably shouldn't go down this path, but the corollary to that, and I think Bronson would agree with this, is that you have a certain culture
Hmm.
uh, as a nation, as a country, that and you can even say, well, it's even if you're non-judgmental about one culture being better than others, but that's why that there was always an effort to have America be the melting pot.
Hmm.
That we we absorb these people, these immigrants, and maybe it changes us too because we're all melting in this melting pot. But we have a unified culture with some common standards,
Hmm.
and the opposite of his view of a successful constitution, of a successful people, is this idea of multiculturalism.
Yeah.
I think he would refute that
Hmm.
as a healthy concept. I don't think he would agree that having separate cultures within your nation is going to be tolerable
Yeah.
over the long term.
Yeah.
At least that's what I might anticipate. So I
Yeah.
think he's 100% right about that, but I don't think that ends it. And I think you have to have a framework for the people of that culture, including the borders and all that kind of stuff, which I
Yeah.
would agree with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. Well, do you have any other thoughts on this chapter here?
A nice short
It
episode.
was a short episode. But yeah, we'll be continuing this next week. He's still got more to say about the American Constitution. So maybe he'll clear up some of those questions we have about
Yes.
how he's actually stating his case here. But if you have nothing else, this has been season 9, episode 10 of Unlimited Opinions. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
Still Mark Bishop.
All right. It's a good episode.
Yes, I am very good.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.